Thank you, Mr. Thambimuthu, for your very, very thought-provoking speech. During his speech, Mr. Thambimuthu touched upon some of the very sensitive issues behind the conflict. And he also challenged some of the widely circulated conceptions, or rather misconceptions. And Mr. Thambimuthu is very, very optimistic about the future. Now, gentlemen, it is the time for discussion and question and answers. We have time till 4 o'clock. The floor is open.
Thank you, sir. I am Wing Commander Munim from Bangladesh Air Force. My query is rather related to military and defense. Army and Rebel, the Tamil LTT, had been fighting a fierce battle for about 3 decades. After the end of the conflict, which was probably very sudden, because from our country we had been watching a prolonged conflict and just ended suddenly with probably some specific direction from the government of Sri Lanka and specific military strategy taken by the defense forces. My query is, after this conflict, the armed forces who had been fighting a fierce battle, they had the fresh blood and fighting anarchy, the syndrome of war still prevailing. How these forces could be reconciled and tackle and rather engage in nation building affairs. So how the government of Sri Lanka challenges to manage these armed forces who just came back from the war field. Thank you, sir.
Could you say something? Mr.
Yeah, I think I would like to say something here. I think the biggest difference is that what most people noticed, after the war ended, the armed forces were present, and there was a big difference. That was, the armed forces personnel did not see average civilian as a terrorist. That fear wasn't there. So that civilians also had the opportunity immediately after the war to mix with the armed forces. So I genuinely believe, had the armed forces have gone back to the barracks after the war, the civilians would not have had that opportunity to meet, talk, because which they did not when the LTT were present, because if you've gone and talked to an armed forces personnel, you would have been killed. So I think that played a part. However, I also believe that in terms of what we witnessed in the reconciliation, reconstruction processes, and especially demining, where armed forces played such a significant role. Remember, demining just did not start now. There was times in the past, during the peace negotiations, a limited amount of demining did take place, and people witnessed the difficulties involved in it. And people witnessed when foreign demining teams arrived and how effective they were, and they witnessed how effective the armed forces have been, especially in areas like in Eastern Province, an area called Wakare, which was heavily fought over and had many areas where they were heavily mined, and the effectiveness through which the armed forces involved and how they managed, maneuvered the local population, creating their environment for them to continue their livelihoods, I think played a big part in the population trusting. Today, I genuinely do believe that if you go and take an opinion of the general population, especially in Eastern Province, that they have such a positive view of the armed forces, and I think that is because the role they played in the 3 years after the war.
Wishes to make a comment.
I
have a quick comment on that. I think it's an excellent question. See, in our view, immediately after a conflict and the end of a war, there has to be a constructive engagement of the armed forces immediately thereafter. If they were left in the barracks, as Arun Thamimuthu quite rightly mentioned, or they were not using their skills in some productive activity, they may have also been lost to society. I think that's one of the important factors that the Sri Lankan defense establishment focused on, was ensuring that there was constructive engagement of the forces after the war. And that, I believe, helped from both sides. The people got the benefit of the forces being involved, and at the same time, the forces themselves were able to use their skills in order to serve society. I saw this in real action just a few days ago, when His Excellency the President went to Vakare, to the area in Batiklo, where the church was reconstructed by the armed forces. And the bishop there gave an amazing tribute, amazing tribute to the forces, where he said that the forces had such a fantastic engagement with the people, and that he almost went to the extent of saying that we love them. So I think it's an important factor to recognize that there was this huge connection that was built up, and it served both the people as well as the forces well.
Thank you, sir.
Rohan Gunaratne, an expert in the field.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I fully agree with Mr. Thambimuthu's assertion that ethnicity was never salient in Sri Lanka, except probably 20, 30 years before independence. And it assumed a new dimension because of the influence from Tamil Nadu, the Dravidian movement. I also want to share with you that Chelvanayakam himself was not Sri Lankan Tamil. He came from Malaysia. So these ideas of ethnocentric nationalism was actually foreign to Sri Lanka, because Sri Lankans never thought in terms of ethnicity. For us, it was no problem of dealing with a Sinhalese, Muslim, Tamil, or even a Burgher. So we can say in many ways the extremist ideologies were introduced from overseas because we had perfect social harmony between these communities. Even today, between a Sinhalese, Tamil and a Muslim, there is no dispute at all. This is what political leaders have created in order to win votes. So they politicize, radicalize and mobilize their own communities for political reasons. But I would like to ask both the governor and also Mr. Thambimuthu, what can we do to prevent politicians from campaigning on the basis of ethnicity and religion? Because I think it's very primitive and very primordial on the part of any political party to build their parties based on ethnicity and religion. We should campaign and debate on larger issues that affect humanity, and we should not be divided by ethnicity and religion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you raised an interesting point, and it's also, I think it's important to realize when people talk of press freedom in Sri Lanka, I would like a Tamil reader to take this 3 Tamil national newspapers, and you just read through, and you realize even to this day that separatism, ethnic nationalism has been propagated. And it shows 2 factors. One, the fear of dealing with ethnic issues because of the past that we've had. And secondly, that Sri Lanka still hasn't, in my opinion, dealt with things such as provoking interreligious harmony or provoking religious tension. We haven't brought legislative provisions that are strong enough to deal with. That includes, now today you find that it is the ethnic politics that has grown in the last 40, 50 years and that still prevails. So I do believe that effective legislative provision to outlaw hate speech, for an example, and also to integrate communities, not to try and divide, whether it is administratively or education. I think its time has come to create schools that are common to all, and it's important that we move away from religious schools, ethnic schools, and time has come to truly work on a national policy. And I think that time has come for Sri Lanka to bring in citizenship as part of education policy, where what is to be a Sri Lankan. And ladies and gentlemen, I must say, until very recently, to sing the national anthem in northern and eastern provinces are regarded as the wrong thing to do, because that has been emphasized by politicians, because no, this is not ours. And thankfully now the trilingual policy has taken momentum, but I think time has come to go beyond and try to foster a system where we can ensure that schools and educational establishments are created without reference to ethnicity.
Interesting question again. If I may approach it from a more economic standpoint, I believe the intention should be to make politics as irrelevant as possible in development. Now, Arun just mentioned that the journey from Batticaloa to Trincomalee when he was a child took 7 hours. Now it takes 1.5 hours. Now when you compress these areas and there is very quick travel and the country becomes smaller in that situation, you will find that it's easier to find jobs, it is easier to have livelihood, it is easier for people to get educated. Then as a result, they don't have to go in search of politicians who then would be coming up with various excuses for something to be done or not to be done. So I think the development work that has taken place in the last 4 to 5 years gives us a very clear picture as to what this development can do. Now, although it has been downplayed by many of the Western powers in the recent past, the massive development that has taken place in the North and the East over the last 4 to 5 years, Rohan, has given no issues to them. If by some chance all those development activities had not taken place, the emphasis would not have been on what they are emphasizing today. They would have said, there is no hospital, there is no road, there is no electricity. You are keeping these people in this difficult situation. But today all those points have become irrelevant. People are having livelihood, they are having work, there is economic activity. So little by little, some of those tensions that could have otherwise been there have been eroded. And I think for the future as well, that is the way to go. If we were to ensure that the framework is developed so that people can find a livelihood, there is engagement, then the issues that could perhaps be shown as being the results of ethnic disharmony or ethnicity being the focus would then have to be relegated to the sidelines.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, please. Yeah. If a microphone is given to her. Yeah. Okay, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Clive Jacknick. I'm an independent consultant in post-conflict, currently based in Nigeria. I've formerly worked in Sri Lanka for up to 3 years as part of reintegration of the Tamil Tigers supporting the government rehabilitation program. And you're right, sir, once you come to Sri Lanka, you always come back. And so I'm delighted to be back here. I wanted to make a couple of points in terms of de-radicalization. In every conflict situation that I've been involved in, and that encompasses almost 15 years in Africa and Asia, there's always been a diaspora element. There always has, and it's very much the case with Sri Lanka as well. And I recall 2 particular things of note. One was the efforts by the interim Somali government, whom I advised last year and the year before when I went across from here, at their request to give some advice on Al-Shabaab in terms of de-radicalizing potential recruits to Al-Shabaab back in the United Kingdom, and how they went about it, even as an interim government, and how they worked with the United Kingdom and other elements in Europe in order to reduce that effect of people coming from Europe and basically signing up to do some pretty horrific things in Somalia. And the other one I recall is from Eastern Congo, when I was involved in the DDR program with the United Nations there for several years, and the existence of a Rwandan radio run by one particular ethnic group based in Vienna, in Austria, that was on longwave, inciting hatred and genocide again. So the effect of a diaspora that is not engaged is very, very clear to many people's experience, particularly Africa and Asia. So my question would be, particularly to our colleague who spent time in London as an expatriate in London, are you aware of any evidence of positive engagement between expatriate Sri Lankans, whether from which ethnicity it wouldn't matter, or indeed by people based in Sri Lanka, from the government or from the private sector or wherever else, to ensure that the right message is passed, particularly to the youth of diaspora, who perhaps have never been to Sri Lanka at all, because I consider that, for the future of Sri Lanka, essential to ensure long-term stability. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you've mentioned an important point there. I think maybe through lack of resources, I think the engagement with the younger members of the Tamil diaspora has been very limited. And I genuinely believe that many, if you take young Tamils or young migrants, they tend to favor societies having equality of opportunities, because they have benefited from such policies. I think, unfortunately, the Sri Lankan history has been somewhat interpreted, misinterpreted, and politicized to such an extent that these people haven't been exposed to the realities back home. I still believe that very little has been done, although there are attempts have been made through the External Affairs Ministry and the embassies and so on, but not deep enough, not far enough. And I think that should be probably the strategy that the country has to undertake, to educate them and engage them and even debate with them about the real issues in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Brigadier Nakibos from Uganda. I won't want to emphasize on this engagement. But one, I disagree when you condemn ethnicity. Ethnicity per se has no problem at all. I'm actually an advocate of ethnicity. But when you politicize ethnicity, politicization of ethnicity is what creates a problem. And so, separate politicization of ethnicity, just like Honorable Arun said, pandering to ethnicity in terms of service delivery. That is what creates the problem. So ethnicity itself, per se, is good. All of us need ethnicity for purposes of identity. Now, to Honorable Arun, where do you fit the Tamil, this previous conflict in northern and eastern? Was it identity-based? Was it out of perceived alienation of the people? Because you must get to know what the conflict was all about in order for you to be able to resolve it. You may provide whatever development programs, but if it has not been bought in by the people you are providing, then you would be flogging a dead horse. The third issue really is on the army involvement in development. And Honorable Arun, you rightly said, you cannot disengage the army from that. Uganda People's Defense Forces is an example. Only that we do not hold conferences like you here to now talk about your engagements with the population. Because we believe the army is part and parcel of the population. And whichever activities the army is involved in, it is just a vanguard. And to lead the population where we need to go. But most importantly, really, and all the speakers have been talking about it, is we are doing this. It is really the political will to do that is being done, to commit resources. which is the focus, which is the vital ingredient in all this development. I thank you for your attention.
No, only thing I would say is that when it comes to whether identity crisis, I don't think that that would be as relevant to Sri Lankan context. I think even in the past, there has been times when a perceived inequality has been created through certain policies, but maybe in reality, they were used as a vehicle, as a tool to provocate and create problems. An example would be the language policy. But I think overall, at best, Sri Lanka, probably, I don't know whether you're aware of it, is one of those countries that had the greatest number of holidays of any country that you would come across. Every Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, and you name, it's a holiday. And so that is an example where plenty of provisions have been made for identity. I think it's now, time has come for Sri Lanka to look at really creating foster a national identity as opposed to, because there are plenty of space in Sri Lanka for ethnic identities, I think, whether it's religious, linguistically as well. And I think time has come for fostering a new national identity, which I think has been the failure of the Sri Lankan state in the post-independence era. Thank you.
We have time for others who wish to make a comment or yes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Ashok Mehta, Major General, retired. I was with the IPKF, and I now realize what a great disadvantage it is to be sitting on a flank in a hall as big as this. I would start with a brief observation. The Nigerian Brigadier General made, I think, quite an appropriate comment. Ugandan general made quite an appropriate comment because whichever way you can dress the argument differently, and I do not believe you can take politics out of ethnicity. I mean, you made a very passionate appeal, Arun, on what you said and what you urged, but I do not believe in this day and age, whether it is Sri Lanka or Tamil Nadu or anywhere else, politics is that you can take it away from ethnicity or identity. In fact, you see this on the rise in developing societies. But that comment aside, I have a brief question for the governor. And that question is that in your first presentation in 2011, you made a very cogent remark, in fact, very far-sighted remark, when you said that the Sri Lankan army, by its defeat of terrorism, had put the Sri Lankan economy on an 8% growth rate trajectory. Although the next year, when you made the presentation, the growth had fallen to about 6.5. And you actually mentioned that figure, but today you mention a figure which is averaged out to 7.5%, which is indeed very, very credible. Now my question is, and I'm not an economist and that's why I'm asking the question, that every 10 years we are told that there are external events that rock domestic or developing nation economies. So very briefly, what can go wrong both in terms of external winds as well as in internal winds for Sri Lanka not to be able to meet its target? That's not my desire at all. but I just want to know what might happen. And my question for Arun very briefly is, you talked about youth fleeing or getting away from the east and the north to Australia and Toronto. And since I've had the great opportunity of spending many convivial evenings with your parents in Batticaloa in the late 80s, it's a great shame because the northeast, and I know the east like the inside of my hand, has great deal of potential for tourism, and you singled out tourism as an opportunity. So what incentives are possible both at the central and the state level or the provincial level, A, to dissuade some of these people to get away, and B, to give a boost to these tourism opportunities?
Yes, Governor.
Thank you. I think your assessment, even though you may not be an economist, sounded very much like an economist, so thank you for that question. You asked a very cogent question that I myself ask my team of economists almost on a daily basis. What can go wrong? Well, I can tell you plenty. Today, if you look at the world has very severe crises drawn all over it. And that's a very difficult situation for us to deal with, because whatever that happens in many parts of the world get transmitted very quickly to every other country. Just to give you one classic example, whatever that is taking place in India today is of very significant concern to us, because we see the impact of it being felt in a very short period of time. That is only India, but in many other countries too, it can have repercussions to many developing nations. So Sri Lanka, being a emerging nation, we would need to be watchful about whatever that is taking place in all parts of the world in a very significant manner. Locally, what is mostly of concern to us is to keep the growth momentum in progress. And that is also quite a difficult task because of the fact that worldwide there is tension. We got to keep the external account going, we got to see the growth momentum taking place, we got to ensure that there is distribution of wealth, and we have several goals that we are talking about. The growth is important, but at the same time the macro fundamentals also are important, so we got to keep prices at levels that people are comfortable with, and those will be what is engaging our attention all the time. But what we do in order to deal with what can go wrong is to develop spaces within our economic framework. Because in all these shocks that will take place in the next few years, we cannot ever foresee what its impact would be in Sri Lanka. So what we have done is to approach it in a way where each one of our macro fundamentals is strengthened so that we can take a cushion or take a shock if we have to in the future. I'll give you an example. If you have low inflation, then even if prices are going up worldwide, there is a shock that we can take. Even if the prices go up a little bit, we can still have a reasonable level of inflation being maintained. If our debt is low as a percentage of our GDP, even if there is a need to borrow at a particular moment of time for some exigency, we'll still will have the space to borrow and not get into any serious difficulty. So the approach that many countries have today is to build up some cushion, build up space in order to be able to deal with any shock which can be unforeseen. The mention was made also about the growth momentum. Yes, the last few years have been of strong growth. We did have growth of 8% in 2010. 2011 it went up to 8.3%. Then we found that there was a certain element of slowing down that was needed because of the fact that there was a danger otherwise of the economy overheating. So we put in certain factors into the economy that slowed it down gently. And last year we had 6.5% growth. But this year our platform is stable once again, and we are hoping to have a growth of 7% plus, hopefully to 7.5%, so that we can ensure that the growth momentum that we had targeted could be realized in the way that we had originally thought possible.
We have 5 more minutes to go.
I'll just quickly answer. But, in terms of issues of young youth fleeing our areas, I think number of things. Effective policing, of course, but also on the part of Western countries, especially Australia, Canada, UK, and so on, them realizing and that Sri Lanka is very, very peaceful and being very effective in terms of their asylum policies. But beyond that, I think, like you said, with economic progress, more and more people will stay on. The question is how we effectively implement those policies to trickle down to the individual so that they have a positive outlook. As for just on your comment, General, I agree with you. Yes, ethnicity plays a big part in today's age. It has played a big part historically, but people have multiple personalities and multiple identities. You know, you are a Tamil, you are a Hindu, you are a Sri Lankan. So I think when I passionately feel that our identities our ethnic identities or religious identities are there, and I'm sure people can cherish it. Where we have failed is to emphasize on our national identity, which I think we should concentrate on in coming years ahead. Thank you.
I have a question for Mr. Thambimuthu. I'm at the back here. I'm Charita Fernando. I'm a reporter from Lanka Business Report. You mentioned earlier during your speech that separatist ideology is conceived in the minds of politicians. How many of you in your province share your view that you don't need devolution of power, federalism, or whatever you call it, to win your rights? If there are people that share your view, why is the Tamil community not coming out with their views? Because if they're worried about repercussions, the LTT is no longer present. Why is the Tamil community silent?
Thank you. It's an interesting question. How many people share my view? We have to take a poll to realize how many really do. But I must insist on a number of things here. In terms of, also, we are talking about 60 years of history. Now you take my maternal grandfather was one of those people who propagated the view of federalism, and even to an extent, even people like my mother articulated separatism, because that was the belief of that time. So it takes, now myself, I strongly believe, having grown up in Batticaloa in that environment, to feel that by looking at our history where we have gone wrong. So I have taken a historic decision as far as within my family is concerned to make a difference. And if you ask me how the young people view, I think most young people view that the politicians of the past have made many blunders for which they have paid the price. But I think time is a factor. 60 years of indoctrination cannot be changed in 6 months. It takes time. But what I will tell you is that in Eastern Province, there is a serious voices are emerging that feels that time has come to look at alternatives to existing models, because they can see that there are at times that the benefits, now when you talk of devolution, if you are not a recipient of such processes, then you will not support it. And especially the Tamil community in the Eastern Province do realize that they will not benefit from any powers that will be that will arrive through the 13th Amendment. I think leaving that aside, it is important, because at the moment it is winners and losers. If you are a community that is majority in that environment, if you have the land powers or police powers, you feel that, look, we can take control. If you are a community that is minorities in that environment, you feel that, God, what are we going to do with those powers, because somebody else will benefit from it. But I think what is important for Sri Lanka as a whole is to look at not as winners and losers, by looking at a national policy where everyone can be winners through equality and equality of opportunities. These are not just mere words and terminologies. I think overall, the minorities, speaking as an ethnic Tamil in Sri Lanka, I think we will be great beneficiaries of equality and equality of opportunities. We have seen in countries such as US and many Western countries where we've seen whenever those policies are effectively implemented, that minorities can benefit from it. So I do genuinely believe that if you look at the future, the minority communities in Sri Lanka will increasingly favor policies such as equality and equalities of opportunities, I feel.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Subramaniam Swamy.
If I may be permitted to make a small comment. The use of the word ethnic, in my opinion, both in India and Sri Lanka, is a erroneous use of the word. It's in its original form introduced to mean racial differences. In fact, modern genetic research based on DNA analysis, which is now being published in many foreign journals, do not show any ethnic differences between Indians, amongst Indians, except perhaps peripherally in the northeast, and in Sri Lanka. So obviously both the Sri Lanka people and the Indian people are one, but the British introduced this concept of Aryans and Dravidians, and by distorting words which existed already in the Sanskrit literature, the word Arya actually meant gentleman accomplished, a gentleman or a person accomplished. And the word Dravida meant South India. And they converted that into two communities, racially different communities. And that originally the Dravidians ruled India. Then the Aryans came from Europe across the Khyber Pass and drove the Dravidians to the south. Now, a whole political movement was built on it, the Dravida movement, which is a bogus movement in terms of conception. So today, since we have modern science, this distinction is not there. In Sri Lanka too, there is no racial difference. There are studies, I can't quote them offhand, but there are studies which show that in Sri Lanka there is no genetic racial difference between Tamils and Sinhalese. Even in language, the script has the same phonetic principle, and it seems to have come from the Brahmi script. There are common words of Sanskrit in both Tamil and Sinhala. And in fact, in India, once I remember arguing with Karunanidhi on this issue, and finally I told him, your name is Sanskrit, and you are talking about Tamil. His name Karunanidhi is a Sanskrit word, means a reservoir of mercy. So therefore, I think we should not fall into this Western trap of regarding our differences as caused by ethnic differences. And this whole concept of Tamil nation and all this arises out of this bogus concept. And I would personally agree, Mr. Thambimuthu, that there is now a need to say you may have many sub-identities, but there is need for an overriding national identity which should prevail whenever there is a clash between a sub-identity interest and a national interest.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam Swamy. Distinguished participants, now it's time for us to conclude this session. And thank you all for very attentively listening to this discussion. Thank you again.